Trade and tariffs are on everyone's mind as the Trump administration threatens Mexico, Canada, and China with hefty tariffs. On this episode of FieldLink, we catch up with Helena's Director of Government Affairs, Sean McCarty. He discusses how some of these policies might impact farmers and the industry. Plus, market analyst Jody Lawrence joins us to discuss how the talk of tariffs are impacting grain markets today. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to mark your calendars and join us for the 2025 Commodity Classic in Denver, Colorado on March 1st through the 3rd, as FieldLink will be live. We'll be there with market analyst Jody Lawrence as he will be joined with Chip Flory from Agri-Talk and Sean Haney from Real Ag Radio. Join us in our booth on March 1st and March 2nd for these live recordings as we'll cover the latest in agriculture news, grain markets, policy. Plus, learn a thing or two about some of the latest products and technologies brought to you by Helena. We look forward to seeing you in Denver. And welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith here, and then joining us here in the FieldLink studio is Sean McCarty. He's the Director of Government Affairs. Sean, welcome back to FieldLink.
Good to see you, Bill.
Hey, man, we've got a ton going on. It's the I call it the ultimate game of whack-a-mole.
It is exciting times for sure. We got a Super Bowl coming up, and nobody's even talking about it. We're busy talking about what the price of our pizza is going to be.
I think there's bigger odds in Vegas right now on what tariff's going to pass and which one's not. And literally, Sean, as we're recording this here today, Monday afternoon, we just got notice. Wall Street Journal just popped up on my phone, said we got a 30-day delay with Canada as it relates to all of these tariffs.
Yeah, we saw it first with Mexico. Well, we really saw it with Colombia and then Mexico, that each one of these trading partners of ours has seen the demands that have come out of this administration, and they've been willing to go down to the deadline and say, hey, look, we're going to put these in place. We believe this will hurt you worse than it'll hurt us. Meet us where we want to meet you, and we'll consider. And so look, right now, there's nothing permanent about it, but it buys both parties 30 days to kind of rework what the demands are and where people are willing to come and compromise a little bit.
You know, Shawnee, you and I talked a lot about this. You know, the word tariff gets thrown around very loosely in the media. Everybody's talking about it. But the tariff terminology in this case, and a lot of times it was really kind of the hammer, if you will, for some things that we really want, or in this case, President Trump is looking for. Can you help define those for our listeners and, what that impact could look like?
Yeah, it's a tool. And then House Ag Committee Chairman G.T. Thompson was doing an interview here earlier today saying the exact same thing, which is these tariffs are a tool. And we believe that the priorities of this administration and of this country need to be looked out for. And if we feel like we're at a disadvantageous position, whether that's in agriculture or any other industry, what tools can we use to try and reset the table or balance the equation a bit? And so with tariffs, looking at not only goods coming in, but their effect on goods going out. And so for agriculture, where we're sending our grains, where we're sending our fruits and vegetables, whether that's grain going down to Mexico or dairy going up to Canada, or fruits and vegetables going to Europe and other goods going abroad. The question is, how high of a tariff is too high? What stymies business altogether? And what is enough of a nudge to get you to start moving in the direction we want to? And there's been a lot of concern. I think from the grower community, from the farmer community, you saw groups like the American Farm Bureau. You've seen just business groups like the Chamber of Commerce come out and say, hey, we're concerned. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that this is wrong. We're just concerned because we want to make sure that the end result does not leave too much collateral damage and ourselves laying in the wake to hit the ultimate end goal. And farmers, it's been a tough few years. And so with a depressed ag economy, still inflated cost of goods and land and equipment, looking at potentially 20-25% increases in cost of goods is a terrifying perspective when they were not sure whether they could pay the bills and clear the note for this past year. However, if it works, and right now we've seen a bunch of troops mobilized towards the southern border for border protection, both with illegal immigration and the flow of fentanyl. We've seen in the news that you just mentioned coming out from Canada, mobilizing their border program. So right now, it looks like we're starting to see signs of something working.
Yeah, things are starting to move, and I think that's the biggest key. And you and I chatted here as we were preparing for this podcast. Sean, we're 2 weeks into this administration. 2 weeks. I mean, most administrations are still celebrating their inauguration historically, but this administration is way different.
No, and the difference this time around is President Trump knew how he was going to attack things this time. I think last time when he was elected, obviously extremely confident individual, but I wouldn't tell you that he knew going in that he was going to win. I think there was still a pretty decent sense that Hillary Clinton would win that election. And so when he won, there was probably a bit of a surprise in that the planning hadn't been done. Who would serve a lot of roles? If you look at it, we didn't have an ag secretary nominated until the day before Inauguration Day. I mean, everything was very slow to roll out there. He was trying to figure out where the bathroom was and who he would put in places. And some of those didn't work. They were terminated within a few weeks and a few months. This go round, he had time to plan. Yeah. He mapped everything out, how he was going to attack it. And so he hit the ground running as soon as he got in that office. And you saw that with 200 executive orders and a strong approach to trade and tariffs and what's going on with Canada and Mexico and China, which maybe isn't 25%, but 10% is still pretty steep.
Big number for as much as we're bringing in.
Absolutely is. And, he was soft on it day one. He didn't come out and mention it day one, but that'll be the next big one. And they are a large consumer. They're also a massive producer for us, probably feel like they have a lot more leverage than Canada or Mexico do. So it's why we have not seen resolution to that one, although we understand they've spoken at least a couple times since Election Day or since Inauguration Day.
President Xi and
Trump, I believe Xi and Trump are due to speak again here in the very near future to see if they can come to some sort of middle ground.
Just that alone.
Yep.
2 or 3 conversations within a few weeks is mind blowing, and I think you bring up a really good point. Trump's first round, he was the new guy on the block. He'd never been in politics before. He's a business guy, and he's figuring out where's the bathroom, right? As you mentioned, this time, I think it feels like he went through that first 4 years of just kind of learning the ways of working, so to speak, in D.C. And then he applied his business principles, and things are moving fast. Whether you like it or not, it's moving. That's for sure. There's a lot of noise going on. Sean, let's talk a little bit about some of these potential tariffs and what does that mean to growers. When I think about Canada, certainly the first thing that pops in my mind is we bring a lot of potash in from that country.
Bring a lot of potash. I think the number was 80% of the potash coming in. Yeah, I mean it's definitely a concern from an input pricing standpoint. Sure. Whether you're faced with a decision of I'm going to buy potash at an inflated cost and cut back in other areas of my operation, or I'm going to mine my soil and cut back on my fertility. But over the last 2 years with inflated costs, that may have been something you were already doing. And so you can only afford to mine your soil for so long or skimp or cut back, especially when you're trying to push a crop. Everybody wants a bumper crop when prices are great.
Sure.
But a bumper crop when prices are marginal at least helps you pay the bills, right?
Exactly.
So you do understand that you have to push it. So fertility at its core, to get out of the gates running and just make sure that crop has a chance is paramount. And so there's some very real concerns with regard to the fertilizer.
Because the alternative is the rest of the potash pretty much in the world comes from Russia.
Yeah, I mean, we've got minimal supply in other countries. So, I mean, certainly, and then that comes with,
who do you want to do business with, right?
Yeah, its own sets of complications. I mean, there's a domestic supply to a certain extent, and we've looked at, legislation to designate some of the macronutrients as critical minerals, which would pull back some of the red tape, pull off the regulatory constraints of domestic production of some of these macronutrients, but that's still a ways away. And so for the short term, there would still be significant pain there. And our access to whether that's potash or phosphate or various forms of nitrogen, that varies macronutrient to macronutrient of what country we're getting it from. And so when we get into these tariff conversations and these duties, it's important to recognize that we can't talk to them in a blanket policy type form. We have to understand that each one of them comes from a different area. There's varying supplies domestically and where those supplies are going, whether just by the free market or availability. And so looking at this on the surface, we can tolerate a little bit of more inflation with regard to our pricing, but obviously whatever we can do to ensure that our farmer customers and our ranchers and other customers are able to keep doing what they need to do to protect their investment and maintain their operation, that's core to our belief.
Well, certainly a lot of impact with potential tariffs that could impact certainly agriculture, but really all of us, all sectors. I mean, we're talking fertilizer here in this situation. There's a whole lot more that can impact going both ways too.
That's right. And something that may have nothing to do with us could have a very real impact. And that's the concern that folks have was we don't want to be the collateral damage. We don't want to be the ones that pay the ultimate price to solve a much larger goal. We do want to get in the best position possible, but we also don't want the farm economy to be what it took to get us there. But export markets, the potential to lose grain markets. We've already seen Brazil drastically ramp up their soybean production.
Absolutely.
A number of other countries have become outlets for folks that are looking for goods. We've got ongoing issues within Europe on the residue limits that they set for crops that are being sold in Europe and how that puts handcuffs on our agronomic practices in the United States. So we've lost some markets. I think there are still some really good opportunities out there, but much will be determined by the next probably, usually I'd say months, but it could be a matter of weeks before we see what agriculture exports, at least for 2025, look like.
Right, and it is really moving fast. And Sean, by the time this podcast hits, we could have a whole
It'll
new
be completely
level
obsolete.
of policy. It's going to be changing, but and I think that's it's interesting. And we had Jody Lawrence on in our podcast, and we talked a lot about just have your plan, work your plan, and I think that's going to be true for all producers as we look at 2025. We've got to manage through this volatility, and there's certainly a lot of that going on. Sean, certainly tariffs top of the mind. It's catching all the headlines, but there's still a whole lot going on at D-State. Right now, we're going through a lot of hearings, Senate hearings, and trying to get some secretaries put in place.
We are, and so far, other than one or two, Secretary Hegseth, on the defense side, was down to the finest of margins, with Vice President Vance breaking the 50-50 deadlock. But most of the nominees, I think, are expected to make it through. They've all got challenges, not only from the Democratic side of the aisle, but also within the Republican Party, and folks that have some issues with some of the history that these nominees present. I think Secretary Rollins, who's nominated for the USDA post, the all belief is that she will move right on through. You'll see her and a number of others move through the.
Rollins, a native of Texas.
She is, yep.
Texas A&M
Texas
grad.
A&M grad, so not heavily involved in her day-to-day life in agriculture anymore, but
she was a 4-H FFA kid, had livestock.
She was, and she's got some good friendships within our industry, and is not afraid to get out and listen. And I think will be a good secretary for us. Maybe different than Sonny Perdue the last go round in terms of her background, but a well-received nominee. And so, as you've seen, the Attorney General's been passed through. Most of these folks, there's no opposition there. There's going to be some party line stuff, but for the most part, they're going to go through. The Kennedy one will be the one that remains to be seen. And that's an interesting one. Fox News did a poll on all the cabinet officials or nominees. And I think with 48%, Robert F. Kennedy actually had the highest favorability amongst the public. Now, where that poll was conducted and really how they got that sample size.
Yeah, sure.
But he also probably faces one of the biggest tests. And that is because there is a number of Republicans that have very real issues with his past, not only from a litigation standpoint and things that he litigated, but also some of his stances on vaccines and pesticides and a number of other things. For us, that was a very real concern that the industry tried to make sure we had talking points in there in the hearing, was his view on pesticides. And you don't have direct oversight at Health and Human Services, but you definitely have control over kind of the health and food industry.
You influence a lot of things.
Absolutely. And that influence carries a lot of weight. Yeah. And so chairman of the Finance Committee will have an interesting vote there. He's a doctor by trade.
Yep. And Louisiana senator.
Yep. And whether he votes yes could be a big factor, right? He can lose 3 and still be down to 50, and then the tie would be broken by the vice president, but 4 would be the death knell. Wow. And you've already seen it with Senators Murkowski and from Alaska and Collins from Maine, Cassidy, and a number of others that have some very real concerns about Kennedy's past and what it would look like in control of HHS. So there was 2 days worth of popcorn eating watching that hearing. That will probably be the most exciting one out of all of them.
And anticipating a vote as we record this
tomorrow,
Tuesday.
Yeah, they will likely vote out tomorrow in committee. I would think he'd get out of committee and go to the full Senate, and then we'll see. But there's also the political capital being spent by the administration themselves saying, hey, look, you are completely within your will to vote against our nominee, but we carry a lot of influence in the elections. And if you do vote against our nominees, we will remember you, whether you're Republican or Democrat, we'll remember you come primary time. Yep. So there's a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure. Now, if you're Mitch McConnell and you're not seeking a new term and you're on your way out, you kind of just speak your mind.
Vote your mind, right? Yeah. Some of the others may be influenced by some of those comments, both ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other secretaries that you kind of, we're still working through this one?
I think that for the most part, I think Hegseth was the one, when Matt Gaetz was nominated, I thought Gaetz and Kennedy would be the two. Hegseth has a past. There were a lot of questions about alcohol, and anytime you bring in the word sexual abuse and stuff like that,
personal stuff, right?
You're going to throw up a red flag, and you see that with Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, who was really at the middle of that conversation, being a veteran herself and having experienced some of those issues. That was personal for her.
Right.
We can talk about it all being professional and doing what's right for the voters, but those things become personal. But I think that Gaetz and Kennedy were the two that we looked at and said, okay, those could be controversial for the most part. The others will be controversial Republican to Democrat, but not as controversial within the Republican.
Where do you, what's your feel there?
And you bring her up, and I'm not sure. She could be the other one that you could see enough move from the Republican Party. That said, I think with some of what she said and the fact that she's come over from the Democratic side of things and she's a Trump nominee, I think that speaks volumes to the body of this is the woman I want doing this.
Right.
I could have picked a lot of other folks. I picked a woman who ran for president as a Democrat.
Yeah.
Only a handful of years ago.
Against him, technically, in that same era.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of pressure there. Yes, in the media, there's a lot of like, are you a Russian asset? And why are you reporting things? And her replies have mainly come out of in the name of transparency, of I'm not going to lie about these things. Here are all the things that we need to be fully transparent about. And whether that's the Doge and Elon Musk or whether that's Trump himself or anybody else, the one thing that they are really promoting is transparency, that the American public deserves to know these things. And so I get a sense that she makes it through, but anything's possible.
It's let's go to Vegas, right? See what the odds are. But no, I think you bring up a great point, and just as a viewer, I guess, I mean, it has been a little bit nice to, whether you like it or not, what you hear, the transparency with the press secretary and just getting information out. At least you kind of know, and it feels like it's pretty transparent to this point.
That's right, and that's what this generation, has really asked for, whether that's in politics or corporate life or the relationship between kids and parents. That dynamic is spread across all those spectrums, which is transparency. Parents talk to their kids or socially engage with their kids in a way different manner than your grandparents and your great-grandparents did. They are way more transparent. The information sharing exists. And as much as they ask that of their parents or of their family, they ask that of their employer, and they're asking that of their government.
Right.
And so that's speaking directly to somebody. That's appealing to something that they're looking for in all aspects of their life, and it's what moves the needle.
Well, at an area that's probably hadn't got a whole lot of attention because of the noise of tariffs and some other unfortunate circumstances in Washington and Philadelphia recently, is the fact that the press corps is shifting a little bit.
It is.
Where they're incorporating some different non-traditional press credentials.
And you would look at that and go, adapting and the changing times and the changing media makes complete sense. And I get that somebody's feelings are going to get hurt, but that's always going to happen. That's going to happen in trade. That's going to happen anywhere. So I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. What was interesting was the news agencies that are housed over at the Pentagon. And so they have removed 4 of them to rotate 4 new ones in. So I can't remember off the top of my head the 4 that got, I think it was Politico. I can't remember if it was CNN or one of the MSNBC, maybe CBS, but there were 4 outlets that got removed. So they have offices within the Pentagon to report on all matters that are going on. They've been asked to leave their offices, and they're going to bring in 4 new ones.
Non-traditional.
Well, yeah, I mean, kind of not traditional. But what was interesting is you look at it and you go, okay, it was Breitbart, One American News, and then Huffington Post.
Oh.
And you sit here and go, okay, conservative media outlet, somewhat conservative, pretty conservative media outlet, and then the Huffington Post,
to the other side.
Which nobody has ever said is a media or a conservative media outlet.
Exactly.
So you can't just say, hey, look, we're only filling it with groups that
conservative content
that think like us or talk like us. So when you see things like that, it kind of backs everybody down a bit to go, okay, hey, you know what? Sometimes change isn't a bad thing, right? And this is just giving some other folks an opportunity, and it's hard to stand against that.
No, yeah, you're right, and I think that might send a strong signal to all of the media that hey, let's maybe raise the bar, all tides, so to speak, and let's get it right, if possible. So, okay, let's talk about some other things going around the globe and coming from D.C. and how things are kind of impacting growers today. Some of the things that we talked about we don't have all the answers yet, but the Endangered Species Act. It's certainly starting to catch some traction this year, where we've got our first label that came out through the EPA that has some of these standards in there. Sean, can you walk our listeners through really the 3 big steps, 3 areas that they need to be aware of as they get ready to farm in 25?
Yeah, so part of the mega settlement, the legal settlement between the EPA and NGOs with regard to endangered species was that EPA had not been doing the proper consultations of assessing the risk of whether that's a herbicide, insecticide, whatever the pesticide is, the impact it would have on the habitat or plant or animal. And so the agreement with the marine fisheries and national wildlife folks is we will do these assessments on the front end. And so every product that is registered or is up for its annual or its 15-year regulatory review period will undergo this new process. The herbicide strategy, so that's the EPA strategy for all herbicides, has been finalized, was finalized late summer of 2024. The insecticide strategy, rodenticide strategy, and fungicide strategy have all yet to be finalized. Moving forward, we don't know what that means. With this administration pausing things that have not been finalized. However, the herbicide strategy was finalized, and what that means is every label that goes through that new process will undoubtedly have a set of points on there. Now, you may not, but many of them will have on the label that will say this requires a minimum of 3 points or 6 points or 9 points. Every time you make an application, if you have a pesticide in the mix, or in this case, if you have a herbicide in the mix, you will need to ensure that whatever product has the highest number of points in that mix, you've got the appropriate number of points for every field you're applying in. So you will need to look, see the points, go to EPA's mitigation website, or maybe you have a third-party opportunity to look at the chart. And there's a number of things. There's parts of the country that are just not very prone to runoff and erosion.
Right.
And so that field may automatically have 2 points.
Or
it may have a berm in it, or it may have tiled drainage, or you may have buffer strips, or any number of things that may get you a point or 2. You may work with a certified crop advisor or nutrient management planner. That might get you a point or 2. When you get to the application, the types of equipment or the rates you use, that may earn you a point or 2. The soil type. So many farms and many places where we place these herbicides are going to be able to get to those points on most of their fields, but you're going to need to have a record of it. How did I get to those points? Outside of that, You will also need to look at your pesticide use limitation areas. So you'll have to go to a website. Bulletin's live too. On EPA's website, and there's a map of the United States, and you will zoom in. You will type in the EPA registration number for whatever products you're using, and you will have to identify: am I in an area of the country where there is a mapped shaded area? And if I'm in there, or if any of my fields are in there,
my field is,
I click on that little zone, and it will pop up and tell you. Like with Liberty Ultra, there's an area east of Nashville in Tennessee that you cannot apply that product between, I think it's like September 15th and May 15th. Okay. And so there may be additional restrictions to that product in those mapped areas based on an assessment of species in that geography. You need to look at that within 6 months of application. Those maps can change on a rolling basis. As long as you've looked at that map within 6 months of application, you're clean. And then there's the buffers. So there's downwind buffers. They could range from 10, 20, 30 feet to 300 feet. And there's opportunities for you to not have buffers depending on what you're up against, roads, other farmland. However, if you do require the buffers, you will have to then go after a number of mitigation steps if you want to reduce those. One of those being the use of a drift control agent or drift reduction agent, oil emulsion adjuvant or another type of adjuvant. Your nozzles, a number of other things can reduce that. So a lot more planning is going to go into the application of, right now, herbicides. Nothing else has been finalized, so everything else, you continue just like you have in the past. But with herbicides that have undergone that new evaluation, so the new ones that came out and registered, or the ones that have gone through their new regulatory review, that will be the practices in place. It will take years before this really starts impacting many products, but best to get out in front of it and start learning the process now and getting that planning built into the system.
It's you and I talked about this. It's not like it's really hard. It's just another step, another process. And I think one of the points too is it really is up to the person applying the product that they need to know, because they're the ones held accountable, correct?
It is, and that's where it becomes, is the landowner involved because you're making changes to the land or looking at dynamics of the land, the farmer, and being aware of what's the slope of your land and the soil types. There's an agronomy aspect for anybody that's doing consultation. There's the sales folks and agronomists that are selling or advising people there, and then there's the applicator themselves, whether that's a farmer applicator, a custom applicator that does custom application work for a business, a Helena that has custom application as a service. Ultimately, that person applying will need to be able to show the record of exactly how you got
to those points
and that buffer strip and how you did it all to have that record.
That's a lot of content, a lot of background work, and increases the value of custom application for sure.
Absolutely. And the question out there is, could this all go away? So there is a process under congressional review where you can go back a certain amount of legislative working days and undo something that's been finalized. There's a bit of a back and forth right now on the legal end of this. This was a legal settlement basically saying that they had to do this. If you undo a regulation...
I think that's really important for folks to know. This is a legal deal. This isn't Congress. This isn't... this is the law.
And the way this was... And there's even some additional wrinkles in that this was designed to be guidance from the EPA on how to use products, not a new regulation, but it was posted in the Federal Register as such. And so there's a question over, is this a regulation and can you undo it? Using congressional review, if you undo something, you cannot later re-offer up anything that is substantially the same. So if you're going to offer up a new herbicide strategy or a new way of addressing the endangered species consultations, it can't be substantially similar. It's going to have to be different. And legally, how do we define what would be different? Could we make it better? Absolutely. Is congressional review the best way to do it? Remains to be seen, or you could just work with EPA and Congress to make some updates to it. But you also have to have in the back of your head that if you undo it and you have to offer something substantially different in its place, could you go down a path where you end up with a product as complicated as this is that ends up being worse?
Yeah, it could be a whole different challenge. And I think there was a lot of people thinking, wow, we vote this administration and it'll go away. But that's really not the case here.
No, could the other ones go away? Sure, but then we're operating two different ways with our pesticide registrations, which with the lack of people at the Office of Pesticide Programs, the EPA, I'm not sure they need any additional confusion or complexity to their work.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. As we're into week 2 again of this administration, lots of emails, lots of awareness or alerts, rather. A lot of folks probably finding out if they got a job or not. How's that going to impact growers at both USDA and, in our case, the EPA?
Yeah, on the surface, there's a lot of concern.
Yep.
We certainly see a tremendous amount of inefficiency within a number of regulatory bodies, whether that's at the state or federal level. That said, we've talked on here before that the Office of Pesticide Programs is who does those registrations. Or if we find and we want to put a new crop on a label, find a new supplier that maybe sells it to us for slightly less, which allows us to be a little bit more competitive in a certain market. Those things used to take months, and now they're taking years. If we lose more folks, we have not been shown a pathway where that situation gets better. So the offered up severances and 6 months of pay if you quit now, or just the ideologies that are coming out, there's certainly always going to be career officials that say, you know what, I'm done.
Yeah.
I've had it. I'm not going to sit here through this. You will pick up some new folks, but the attrition usually, they're already losing just about as many people as they pick up every year. So we're looking at a downturn in an office that we couldn't afford a downturn.
Right.
So from a product availability, novel products coming out, additional crops on labels, other suppliers and better formulations, not looking that great right now.
It's slow.
Yeah.
It's slow today and potentially looking to get slower.
Potentially slower.
I mean, you know this as well as I do. We've got labels that have been around for 6 and 7 years trying to get pushed through, and we're still waiting.
That's right. And other agencies, you said some of it will be very good for our industry, right? I mean, there's a lot of over-regulation, misguided regulation, no checks on whether the regulation even works or is helpful other than just a cost.
Right.
So plenty of reasons to look at it and see some great opportunities there. But even within the Department of Agriculture, you've heard the grower community sound off the alarms about some of the rhetoric out there about getting rid of crop insurance and commodity support and funding that goes to USDA. Brooke Rollins came out and advocated, said, listen, I'm with Trump. I support his agenda, but I also understand that we need to make sure that we're protecting America's farmers. And so that's another agency that we will certainly keep a close eye on with regard to where the funding is going. If funding cuts are happening, where are they happening? If they're inevitable, let's just make sure that we're keeping money in the most prioritized buckets.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of noise there between SNAP and crop insurance is the hot button clearly for a lot of producers out there. But, in terms of the employee side of things, I've heard the stats, the stats, 11% of the workforce in D.C. at USDA shows up to work every day. And then, I don't know if that, 89% necessarily feels good for a lot of taxpayers, right or wrong.
No, and that's where you get the frustration from outside the Beltway, and 11% is actually high when you really look at overall. It might have been closer to 6 for the government. So getting folks back into the office and trying to put some accountability in there is a good thing, and it resonates with us, right? Farmers are out there with their head down, just trying to scratch it out and make it work and get through the bad year to the good year, and they want to know that anybody that they're working with, whether that's from a trade standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, anybody that has a hand in their operation is also working hard.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think everybody can get behind, which is we just want to make sure that the people we're relying on are working and working hard.
Yeah.
And that's not always been the
and that doesn't mean it can't have a shift somewhat, but boy, that one feels a little out balanced when you're in D.C. where you think things should be happening.
It does. And then look, there's a lot of businesses in D.C. that would like them to come back because a lot of those businesses suffered when folks moved out and they worked remotely from another state, or they live inside the Beltway or outside the Beltway and commute in. But when they're not coming into the offices, restaurants and businesses, they all suffer.
Yeah. I mean, it was a ghost town. I was there, with the foreign broadcasters, and it was like, wow. I mean, there's clearly, some congressmen and senators, but after that, it was tough. It felt like 1 out of 4 restaurants was open at times. So
we got to build Washington back again. Started with the football team, and now we're working on
there you go. Well,
the
you almost got there, right? Well, Sean, is there anything else top of mind right now that growers want to hear about from a policy standpoint, and some things happen in D.C. and even at the state government level?
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of states that really ratchet up their regulatory policies, try and get things passed that show that they see the right approach to some of the challenges, and that Donald Trump's approach and the current administrations are not. Electric vehicles, President Trump has come out and said he's not going to pursue any EV mandates at the federal level like the Biden administration. However, a waiver was granted California just before Biden left office that allowed them to pursue a waiver where by 2035, all light-duty passenger vehicles sold in California would be EVs. Wow. It starts, I think, in 2026, and it's a gradual process. There were, I think, a dozen other states that all said, California, if you get that waiver, we will follow suit. And so while many of the other waivers were pulled back on heavy-duty trucks and others, and we don't see anything happening at the federal level, it will be interesting to see how we have a number of states navigate this new administration and what happens with the trade negotiations on auto parts, feeding some of these EVs and where the EVs are coming from. So you'll see things like that. You'll see some other labor standards that really get ratcheted up, some environmental standards. But yeah, there'll be a number of things to watch at the state level, no different than the past Trump administration. Under Republican administrations, blue states really ratchet things up. And so you just have to keep your eye on it and do the best that we can. I think from an agricultural standpoint, bans and restrictions on seed and chemical and fertilizer, just staying involved in those conversations. We've seen attempted restrictions in a number of states so far, in what's still very early in 2025. And so making sure that we educate, and that's educating everybody. That's not a Republican or a Democrat thing. Education is key. And to the folks out there listening, whether you're a farmer, rancher, forester manager, golf course superintendent, Helena branch manager, sure, we all owe it to ourselves to ensure that we educate people, yep, whether they're urban, rural, Republican, Democrat, they don't believe in anything, just to make sure they understand of what our industry is and the negative and positive impacts of a lot of the policy initiatives. And we are an agricultural nation, and as long as we want to feed and defend ourselves, yep, our industry is still going to be core to this country. But sometimes you need to ratchet up your education campaign.
That's right, Sean. Lots of things happening in the energy space. President Trump, was committed to bringing fuel down, and while that's really great, we're obviously talked about the tariffs and some of the trade things there. What's happening in terms of exploring? We've heard the rumbling drill, baby, drill. Where are we at? Yeah,
that's a really interesting, we've got this interesting dynamic between oil and gas, especially in the southern U.S., parts of the upper Midwest, and then ethanol country.
Yes.
And then we had an extra layer, which was biofuels being used for sustainable aviation fuel, which was viewed as another great market. Not going to be a massive, not 33% or something like ethanol, but another big market for our biofuels.
And a new market.
That's right. That does not look like it's going to come to pass under this administration. We did favor ethanol pretty well in the last administration, but drill, baby, drill. The old, the idea of let's loosen things up here and get back to securing our nation's oil supply and being an exporter. I think that there's a lot of reasons to believe that energy cost should come down. How those folks get along with the ethanol folks will be an interesting dynamic to watch. But the sustainability aspect, I think, is a market that within the ag world will be one that we have to decide, while it may not be mandated, is that something that the industry tries to pursue from a voluntary standpoint? Sure. Because it creates a market. I think that's where the industry being divided has a long road ahead of them.
Okay.
Not that you're necessarily farming oil down there in Texas, but there's some significant differences of opinion as to what we should do. Historically, if you look at like trade associations like the Agri-Retailers of Association, who represent the nation's retailers, they would tell you we pursue an all of the above energy strategy. So nuclear, oil and gas, ethanol, wind, solar. I think they will continue to do that. I think we want to keep a diverse energy supply in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that will continue to be a sticking point.
Do you foresee some funding coming our way for refineries? Because that's kind of the quiet thing that a lot of people don't think about. They hear drill, baby, drill.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Let's refine.
I don't know. From a funding standpoint, I'm not sure what it looks like.
Okay.
I really don't. One of the biggest things that we're seeing in the ag world is questions about solar. So whether you're in Texas or Michigan or Florida, there's been a huge movement to put up solar panels for solar in agricultural areas. And it doesn't discriminate good land from bad land. And that's one of the biggest complaints, which is, hey, if you're going to take the land and put solar panels on, at least put it on the bad land. But we're seeing it put on productive land. It's a difficult predicament for groups like the Farm Bureau, who are large proponents of personal property rights. And so if a farmer has 5,000 acres and he's a great customer of yours, and he decides he's going to take 250 acres or 500 acres and put solar on it, that's his perspective.
Right.
And so that's a challenge, which is we understand that our customers need to diversify. Mm-hmm. We don't want to lose agricultural land, but they need to diversify. And we see that growing, whether mandated or not. We see those markets expanding. So agriculture needs to figure out how we're going to work hand in hand with that industry.
Yeah, the trickle down on that is at some point it could impact our food security.
That's right.
If we're taking good productive soil and covering up with solar panels.
That's right. And so you see states, not so much the federal side, but you do see states talking about, could you identify, no different than we do with reserve land, but could you identify certain lands where these practices would be allowable or preferred or regulated and mandated, or are there caps?
Sure.
So by county, is there a cap of only 10% or 20% of farmland? Said not the easiest of conversations, but in the energy world as it pertains to agriculture, I've probably heard less about oil. Certainly we always follow, the price of natural gas, the impact that has on fertilizer, commodity prices. But the biggest concern I've heard at the state level is agriculture's interaction with solar.
Well, Sean McCarty, I want to thank you for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink as we navigate this crazy time and lots of stuff happening in D.C. We'll look forward to having you back here to bring us up to speed here in the near future.
Appreciate it, Bill.
And welcome back to FieldLink, and joining us is Jody Lawrence. Jody, you're on the road today.
Yes, in Wisconsin, we are staying a couple nights, Wisconsin Dells, and hit a couple of wholesale customers of Helena to get out the word, talk about tariffs, and talk about just the new landscape now that we are already a month into the trading year, which is even more shocking than the fact that how quickly last year went by.
Well, today we're recording this podcast on February 3rd in the afternoon. And Jody, we're looking at our phones real quick, following our feeds. As we're recording this podcast, the news is changing minute by minute. And we just got some news from the media. The tariffs, which is the hottest topic right now in the media, around the world for that matter, pulled the reins back a little bit. President Trump pulled the reins back a little bit, paused things in Mexico. Tell us a little bit about that and how are the markets reacting?
Well, it was really the way he telegraphed everything that was going on. Nobody should have been surprised Saturday when he announced he was going to do it, because he kind of said, we're thinking about it and leaning towards it on Friday. You go back up through every bit of his campaign, they were disciplined, whether you like the policies or not. They stuck with their policies. They won the election handily, and he came in and immediately started, the executive order flurry. And he said he was going to put on tariffs. He was going to close down the border. He was going to stop drugs. He was going to get help with Chinese trade. And they're following through on exactly what they said they were going to do, which, for Washington is probably the first administration in a long time that's been able to accomplish so much on exactly what they ran for. But when he announced the tariffs, that he was leaning that direction on implementing them tomorrow, February 2nd. On Friday, the stock market was down over 600 points at one time. All of our markets closed sharply lower on Friday, 10 to 15 cents on just the unknown of what would happen. And then Saturday, he confirmed it that we are following through 25% on Canada and Mexico, I think 10% on Canada's energy that we import, and then 10% additional on everything from China. And the markets immediately last night at the Sunday night electronic 7 o'clock open, beans were 10 to 12 lower, corn was 8 to 10 lower, wheat was even a little bit more than that. And the Dow at one point overnight was down over 600 points. And then you get the right about 9:30 Central, the word came out of Washington that President Trump had already talked to Mexico's President Sheinbaum and had a very substantial conversation to a point where President Trump decided to delay implementing the tariffs on Mexico for another 30 days so that they could continue to negotiate, find common ground, work through some of the probably stickier details of what they want. But that gave the markets a complete reversal. In the course of about 10 minutes, corn went from 8 down to 6 up. So just that nature of probably what we're in for a lot during this process, because the markets are still going to react to headlines. And the reason why they are able to react to headlines so quickly, it's not because people can move faster than they do or used to, but because of all the AI technology, all the algorithms that go into these trading platforms. If they see a headline, if they see a key word in a tweet, the markets shoot first and ask questions later.
Right.
And that's exactly, what happened overnight. And then when they saw the delay of the tariffs, markets rallied back up. So basically, we're about where we were at the close of business on Thursday, with probably what we would consider some substantial progress made with the negotiations with Mexico.
Yeah, it's certainly a time with a tremendous amount of volatility, and it's really hard for growers to try to outguess the market. But that's why it's really important to have a good plan and a strategy in place.
Absolutely. And the thing that we've really been preaching so far this year, I think this week we'll be meeting, I think 28 and 29, is the margins are so tight this year and the nature of everything so volatile. Because one thing I didn't even mention was we get a lot of potash from
Right.
Canada, and the price of potash overnight went up $80 a ton. And there are just going to be a lot of things a lot of moving parts that you have to pay attention to. And that is the craziest part of it, that we're going to be subject to this type of volatility for, as long as there are negotiations. And the hope, and there was even kind of an article, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal this morning, that China has already been open to talking about revisiting the phase one trade deal for buying I think over 65 billion of all U.S. products, but doing it that now is the starting point of the new negotiations. So it took 2 years just to get to the phase one point, and to think that the tariffs were this administration's been able to accomplish that in the first 2 weeks of his administration. We're way ahead of where we were in 2018 and in Trump 1.0 for sure.
Well, certainly as we speak, a lot of things are happening. President Trump and Trudeau up in Canada, they're hopping on a call this afternoon. Who knows? This could get kicked down the road a little further, could loosen those markets up. There's just so much uncertainty right now. And to your point, potash being a major product that's imported to the United States, that's certainly going to impact potentially the markets, or at least shake them up for a day and create, as you mentioned, a lot of noise.
Yeah, it just so much stuff that you can't predict all of the ripples when when these rocks are thrown into the pond about, are things going to be positive, or things going to be negative? Things that we thought were probably negative may turn into positives, because you saw it today that how quickly some positive things got done just with the threat of the
Right.
of the tariff hammer. And that's all you can really ask for in this. If we get everybody to the negotiation table, this is not the start of, $5.50 corn and $14 beans,
Right.
but it certainly raises the floor that we all had a very, high level of concern about, that we'd be right back growing 390 December corn when we were harvesting it this fall. So I'm cautiously optimistic, simply the way today's everything just kind of rolled out.
Well, I think it's important too for listeners to realize, while we're recording a lot, and a lot of our energy and focus is around agriculture, all of these tariffs really didn't have a whole lot to do with agriculture. I mean, they certainly touch it, but it had to do with border security. It had to do with stopping fentanyl coming across the borders. And I think, that's where, as I understand it, the president's really wants some firm commitments from both Mexico and Canada in that area. And maybe we'll get that here over the next couple of days, but we certainly got a lot of attention and shaking up a lot of things across all markets for that matter.
Absolutely. And what we're talking about in our meetings is just try to simplify everybody's marketing plan this year. To get back to the basics of it. And one of the big things that I talked to everybody about, and today is a perfect example of the volatility inside the day, is have your standing orders in with your buyers. Because this just as easily could have opened higher last night while we were asleep and then finished lower by the time we were, all up and at our desks or on our phones. So have the order standing, because if the market hits your price at any point while the markets are open, whether you're awake or asleep or on vacation or wherever you are, your buyer's going to be obligated to take that. So you have to don't let the volatility scare you to death, but be actively involved in it. Set your targets, hope they get hit, and then you wake up and you've got a sale that you made while you were asleep, and you're happy at that price. So that's the biggest thing that we're trying to get some people to look at.
Yeah, it's really good advice. And, we shared that on our last episode with you, Jody. We talked about the importance of having that plan in place. And the way we used to market grain, for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years is not exactly how we need to do it today, especially in these volatile markets. We might need to look at it marketing soybeans at a different time of year and corn at a different time of year than we've traditionally done that.
Absolutely, because we hit on it the last time we talked that if Brazil is going to produce a 6 billion bushel crop and all of South America is going to produce an 8 billion bushel crop, with the U.S. producing a 4 billion bushel crop, we need to be selling during South America's growing season when they are having a problem, like back in November when it was dry, right when they were starting to plant.
Right.
Because while we are still, we are the corn grower for the world, and we're still very, very important in the world bean market, the advantage of moving your seasonality of marketing more beans during the winter is that regardless of how big the weather problem is in Brazil or Argentina, it's not going to creep across to your farm. This is not a Midwest drought. This is a whole nother hemisphere away that works in the farmer's favor. And you just have to, update your habits a little bit. The world's a changing place, as we know all too well. And that's just one of the adaptations that we're trying to make to our plans every year.
Perfect segue, talking about South America. Some things happening down that part of the world?
Yeah, Argentina has been in a kind of a dry spot over the last month, and they got some weekend rains. Their crop did get stressed, and I've seen several private and public forecasters cut Argentina's corn and bean yields probably down, somewhere between 30 and 50 million bushels each. And while that is important on the fringe side, kind of goes back to what we were talking about. That helps raise the floor of where these prices could go. But Brazil's big soybean harvest is probably 12-15% done. And the reason why it's going so slow this year are two factors. A, it's the crop's so big, so that always takes longer. And B, it's because there was absolutely no stress any time over the course of the crop, and it's still growing. It's very green. They haven't died, and that's hard on a combine when you're cutting green beans.
Yeah, it can definitely stretch that out a little longer than normal, which could create some opportunities as you mentioned, if growers have their position taken. So, well, Jody, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of FieldLink during these really crazy, volatile times. And I'm sure by the time this podcast drops on Thursday, we'll have a whole lot of updates to provide to our listeners.
Absolutely, and I hope everybody with Denver and the Commodity Classic coming out stops by the Helena booth to give us a shout out and talk about everything that's on your mind, because I know you and I are going to be out there together the Sunday and the Monday.
Absolutely. Looking forward to seeing everybody in Denver this year for the 2025 Commodity Classic. Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to subscribe to the FieldLink podcast so you never miss the latest in agriculture news, agronomy, technology, and markets.